Lieutenant Commander Elizabeth stood in the observation deck of the Galactic Research Station, New Horizon, watching three of the most dangerous predators in known space behind reinforced containment barriers. The Vorthani cubs, and oh, what a laughably inadequate term cubs was for these snarling, crystalline-clawed death machines, had been the centerpiece of heated debate for the past 6 standard hours. "Absolutely ridiculous," Ambassador Fluxmoth declared, his forearms gesticulating wildly as his translator struggled to keep up with his rapid-fire Calarian dialect. "Before we begin, YouTube shows me that 93% of you haven't subscribed yet. Subscribing is free, it really supports our community, and I'd love for you to be part of it. Also, drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from." The pompous diplomat's skin had shifted from its usual pale blue to an indignant shade of violet, a sure sign he was working himself into one of his legendary tantrums. "The Human Council seriously expects us to believe that your species can tame what 3 different military units couldn't even contain without casualties?" Elizabeth kept her expression neutral, though internally she was already composing the colorful response she'd give to her personal log later. The Galactic Council had summoned her here not out of respect for human expertise, but because they wanted a front-row seat to watch humanity fail spectacularly. Again, Representative Vashkon, whose species the hegemony prided themselves on being the galaxy's premier military strategists, leaned forward with the kind of predatory interest that would have made the cubs proud. The mining colony on Kethvar lost 18 personnel to a Vorthani pack attack. These 3, he gestured toward the containment area, are the only survivors we managed to capture alive. Adult Vorthani have killed trained soldiers in full combat armor. What makes you think these offspring are any different? The way he said offspring suggested he found the entire concept of juvenile anything to be a tactical weakness. Elizabeth had read his file. Vashkon's own species hatched fully mature and armed to the teeth. The idea that any creature might need time to develop probably struck him as a design flaw in the universe itself. "Well," Elizabeth said, her voice carrying just enough dry humor to make the aliens wonder if she was taking this seriously, "I suppose we'll find out, won't we?" Through the reinforced transparisteel barrier, the cubs continued their restless prowling. The smallest of the 3, barely the size of a large Terran dog, though Elizabeth suspected that comparison would horrify every non-human in the room, kept to the shadows cast by the containment unit's sparse furnishings. His silver markings caught the artificial light like liquid mercury, creating patterns that seemed to shift and dance across his dark fur. Elizabeth found herself mentally dubbing him Ghost, for the way he seemed to fade into the background. The middle cub was impossible to ignore. Her golden bioluminescent patterns pulsed in what Elizabeth's xenobiology training told her were stress indicators. But the rhythmic glow was hypnotic nonetheless. Where Ghost preferred stealth, this one, Ember, Elizabeth decided, made her presence known with every movement. She moved like contained fire, all restless energy and barely controlled power. But it was the largest cub that commanded the room's attention. His dark blue markings seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating an almost void-like pattern across his massive frame. "Storm," Elizabeth thought, because looking at him felt like staring into the eye of a hurricane, deceptively calm, but with the promise of devastating power just beneath the surface. Unlike his companions, Storm had stopped pacing when Elizabeth arrived. Instead, he sat perfectly still, watching her with an intelligence that made several of the alien observers shift uncomfortably. The behavioral profiles indicate pack-bonded social structures, Elizabeth said, pulling up her datapad and reviewing the limited information they'd managed to gather. Highly intelligent, fiercely loyal to family units, and, she paused, noting an interesting detail, apparently capable of forming emotional attachments that override survival instincts. Emotional attachments? Flux Moth's skin rippled through several shades of incredulous purple. Lieutenant Commander, these creatures are weapons of biological warfare. They hunt in coordinated groups. They can leap 15 meters vertically. Their claws can cut through standard combat plating, and their bite force exceeds that of a Terran great white shark. The idea that they experience emotions is exactly why you asked for human input, Elizabeth interrupted smoothly. The observation deck fell silent, except for the low hum of life support systems. Your military units treated them as hostile combatants. Your containment specialists approached them as dangerous animals to be controlled. But you called us because humans have a reputation for seeing something else entirely. Vashkon's laugh was like grinding metal. Your reputation is for anthropomorphizing everything with a pulse. You see, emotions and bonds, where evolution has simply produced efficient survival mechanisms. Elizabeth turned back to the containment area, where Ghost had emerged from the shadows and was now sitting directly in front of the barrier. His head was tilted at an angle that, on a Terran dog, would have been achingly familiar. Storm had moved closer as well, though he maintained his watchful distance. Only Ember continued pacing, her golden patterns flashing faster now. They lost their pack, Elizabeth said quietly, more to herself than to the assembled diplomats and scientists. Look at the behavioral patterns. This isn't aggression, it's grief. Grief! Fluxmoth's voice climbed into ranges that made the universal translator emit feedback squeals. They're predators! So are humans, Elizabeth replied without taking her eyes off the cubs. So are most successful species, when you think about it. But grief is something else entirely. The room erupted into multilingual arguments about anthropomorphism, projection bias, and the dangers of applying human psychology to alien species. Elizabeth let the noise wash over her, focusing instead on the three young creatures who had become unwilling pawns in a much larger game. The mining operation on Kethvar hadn't been attacked randomly. The Vorthani were territorial, yes, but they typically avoided settlements unless provoked. Elizabeth had read the incident reports what little hadn't been classified anyway. Something about the timeline didn't add up. Adult Vorthani didn't usually hunt with cubs this young, and they certainly didn't leave survivors. I'll need full access to the containment area, Elizabeth announced, cutting through the diplomatic chaos with the kind of authority that came from 6 years of xenobiological fieldwork in hostile environments. The argument stopped abruptly. Full access? Vashkon's voice carried the flat disbelief of someone who'd just heard a proposal for ritualistic suicide. Lieutenant Commander, these creatures haven't been sedated. They're operating at full capacity, and they've already injured 2 handlers who approached them like handlers, Elizabeth said, who used restraints and force protocols and treated them like wild animals to be broken. She turned to face the assembled group, noting how they'd unconsciously arranged themselves in a defensive formation around the room's exits. I want to try a different approach. Which would be? Fluxmoth's skin had settled into a wary green that suggested he was already calculating the political ramifications of a human casualty on his watch. Elizabeth smiled, and it wasn't entirely reassuring. I'm going to try treating them like what they actually are. Traumatized kids who just want to go home. The silence that followed was broken only by a soft sound from the containment area. All eyes turned to see Storm, pressing one massive paw against the transparent steel barrier, directly opposite where Elizabeth stood. His dark eyes, not the mindless gaze of a predator, but something far more unsettling, met hers through the reinforced barrier. For a moment that stretched longer than physics should have allowed, Human and Vorthani regarded each other across the artificial divide. Then, Storm tilted his head, mirroring Ghost's earlier gesture, and made a sound that Elizabeth's translator couldn't parse, but her heart recognized immediately. It was the sound of something lost, calling out to see if anyone was listening. "When do I start?" Elizabeth asked, though she was fairly certain she already knew the answer. Dr. Whitman, who'd been silent through most of the diplomatic posturing, stepped forward with the resigned expression of someone who'd learned not to argue with human stubbornness. The containment protocols can be modified to allow supervised interaction, but I want full medical monitoring and I want backup security teams on standby, Commander Vale added, her hand already moving to her communicator. This is either going to be the breakthrough of the century or the most expensive funeral the Galactic Council has ever funded. Elizabeth nodded, still watching the cubs. Ghost had joined Storm at the barrier now, his silver markings seeming to pulse in rhythm with Ember's golden glow. 3 pairs of eyes watched her with an intensity that made her skin prickle not with fear, but with recognition. Whatever had happened on Kethvar, whatever had torn these cubs away from their pack and left them in the hands of species who saw them only as weapons or specimens, it was about to become Elizabeth's problem. And judging by the way Storm's paw remained pressed against the barrier, as if he was trying to reach through the transparent steel itself, she suspected it was going to be far more complicated than anyone realized. "Tomorrow morning," she said, though part brother Goff of her wanted to start immediately. "I want to review their behavioral patterns overnight, establish baseline stress indicators, and—" She paused, noting how all 3 cubs had positioned themselves to maintain visual contact with her. "I want to understand what they're trying to tell us." As the assembled diplomats and scientists began the complex dance of bureaucratic preparation, Elizabeth remained at the observation window. The cubs remained as well, no longer pacing or prowling, but simply sitting in formation and watching her with the kind of patient attention that suggested they understood, on some level, that everything was about to change. The question was, change into what? Elizabeth had been sitting quietly in the containment area for exactly 2 hours, 14 minutes, and 36 seconds when Ambassador Fluxmoth finally lost what remained of his diplomatic composure. "This is absurd!" His voice crackled through the observation deck's comm system, making the cub's ears twitch in unison. "She's accomplishing nothing! The creatures haven't even approached her!" What Fluxmoth couldn't see, because he lacked both the patience and the observational skills that made humans decent xenobiologists, not physically perhaps, but in ways that mattered far more. Ghost had stopped hiding in the shadows entirely, instead positioning himself where he could maintain constant visual contact with Elizabeth while still feeling secure. Ember's stress patterns had shifted from the rapid, chaotic pulses of panic to slower, more measured rhythms that suggested curiosity rather than fear. And Storm. Storm had been conducting experiments. For the past 30 minutes, he'd been testing the boundaries of Elizabeth's patience with the methodical precision of a born scientist. A step closer, then a careful retreat, when she shifted position. A soft vocalization that might have been a question, followed by attentive, waiting for her response. Each interaction was a hypothesis tested and data gathered, building toward some conclusion that Elizabeth could almost see forming behind those dark, intelligent eyes. "Your methods are unconventional?" Representative Vashkan observed with the dry tone of someone who'd run out of polite ways to say, completely insane. "Military protocols suggest establishing dominance through force and intimidation," Elizabeth said, not bothering to activate her comm unit since she knew they were monitoring everything anyway. "Which is exactly why your people needed medical attention after their last attempt at establishing dominance." She kept her voice low and calm, the same tone she'd use around skittish animals back on Earth. The cubs were listening to every word, their ears tracking the conversation even as they pretended to ignore her presence. Intelligence like that wasn't just dangerous, it was magnificent. Ghost made his move during the third hour, approaching with the kind of careful deliberation that suggested he'd been planning this maneuver for some time. Elizabeth remained perfectly still as he sniffed the air around her, his nostrils flaring as he processed whatever chemical information humans broadcasted. His silver markings seemed to brighten slightly, creating patterns that were almost hypnotic in their complexity. "Interesting," Elizabeth murmured, noting how Ghost's approach had triggered subtle changes in his siblings' behavior. Ember had stopped pacing entirely, and was now watching the interaction with focused attention. Storm had risen from his sitting position, not in a threatening way, but with the alert posture of someone ready to intervene if necessary. Pack dynamics. These weren't just individual predators, they were a family unit with established hierarchies and protective instincts. Ghost was the scout, testing the waters for potential threats or opportunities. Ember was the emotional center, her bioluminescent patterns reflecting the group's collective mood. And Storm. Storm was the decision-maker. "She's making contact." Dr. Whitman's voice carried a note of surprised approval that made Elizabeth smile despite the circumstances. Biometric readings showed decreased stress indicators across all three subjects. "Subjects," Elizabeth repeated, with just enough edge to make her point. "Is that really what we're calling them?" Ghost had completed his initial investigation and was now sitting just within arm's reach, his head tilted in that achingly familiar gesture of curiosity. Elizabeth slowly reached into her pack and retrieved her lunch. A standard ration bar that was probably the least appetizing thing in the galaxy, but which had the advantage of being non-threatening. She broke off a small piece and placed it on the floor between herself and Ghost, then returned to her reading. The cubs watched this development with the kind of intense focus usually reserved for military tactical briefings. "What is she doing?" Fluxmoth's confusion was palpable even through the comm system. "That's not proper feeding protocol." "There is no proper feeding protocol for this situation," Elizabeth said, turning a page in her xenobiology textbook with deliberate casualness. "Nobody's ever successfully established communication with Vorthani cubs before. We're writing the manual as we go." Ghost approached the offered food with careful steps, sniffing thoroughly before taking a tentative bite. His reaction was immediate and unmistakable. His silver markings flared brighter, and he made a sound that could only be described as pleased surprise. Apparently, even apex predators appreciated variety in their diet. The real breakthrough came when Ghost carried the remaining piece of ration bar to Ember, dropping it at her feet with the kind of gentle precision that spoke of deep familial bonds. Ember's golden patterns pulsed once, twice, then settled into a warm, steady glow that Elizabeth was beginning to recognize as contentment. Pack bonding behavior, she observed, making notes on her datapad. Resource sharing between siblings indicates strong social cohesion, despite traumatic separation from parental units. Storm's turn came last, as Elizabeth had suspected it would. The largest cub approached with the measured confidence of someone who'd already analyzed the situation from every possible angle. When he sat down directly in front of Elizabeth, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his massive frame, it felt less like an introduction, and more like a formal audience with royalty. "Hello, Storm," Elizabeth said quietly, using the name she'd given him for the first time out loud. The reaction was immediate and electric. All three cubs went perfectly still, their attention focused on Elizabeth with laser-like intensity. "Did they just?" Dr. Whitman's voice trailed off as the implications hit him. "Respond to individual designation," Elizabeth confirmed, barely containing her excitement. "They're not just intelligent, they're linguistically sophisticated enough to recognize personalized identification markers." She looked at Ghost, noting how his silver markings had begun to pulse in a new pattern. "Ghost," she said, and was rewarded with a soft chirp that might have been acknowledgement. "Ember," she continued, and the middle cub's golden glow brightened noticeably. The observation deck had gone completely silent, except for the soft hum of recording equipment working overtime. Storm's response was different. Instead of a vocalization or light display, he simply pressed his forehead against Elizabeth's outstretched hand with the kind of gentle deliberation that made her throat tighten unexpectedly. His fur was surprisingly soft beneath the armored plates that protected his skull, and she could feel the warmth of his breath as he settled into the contact. "Remarkable," someone whispered, over the comm, though Elizabeth was too focused on the moment to identify the speaker. The afternoon brought new developments that sent the observation deck into near-constant communication with what sounded like half the Galactic Council. Ember had begun responding to Elizabeth's movements with her own bioluminescent patterns, creating a visual dialogue that was both beautiful and scientifically significant. Ghost had taken to bringing Elizabeth small objects from around the containment area, not food or toys, but items that seemed to have caught his attention for reasons known only to him. But it was Storm's behavior that truly unnerved the watching aliens. The largest cub had begun mimicking Elizabeth's posture and movements with uncanny precision. When she sat cross-legged, he arranged himself in a similar position. When she leaned forward to make notes, he shifted his weight accordingly. It was as if he was studying her body language the same way she was studying his species' behavioral patterns. "It's almost like he's—" Commander Vale's voice carried a note of unease that was becoming increasingly common among the observers. "Like he's learning to be human," Elizabeth finished, and the words hung in the air like a challenge to everything the assembled aliens thought they knew about intelligence, adaptation, and the boundaries between species. The real test came during feeding time, when the automated systems delivered the standard protein blocks that had been keeping the cubs adequately nourished but visibly miserable. Elizabeth watched as all three cubs looked at their bowls, then looked at her, then looked back at their bowls with expressions that could only be described as profoundly disappointed. "They're not going to eat," she announced to the observation deck. "They have to eat," Vashkon replied with the kind of military certainty that suggested he'd never met a problem that couldn't be solved with proper force application. "Nutritional requirements are not optional." Elizabeth stood slowly, noting how all three cubs tracked her movement with alert attention. "No," she said, walking to the nearest food dispenser. "But food preferences absolutely are. And right now, these three are telling us that they're tired of being treated like prisoners." She began examining the dispenser's options, scrolling through a menu that contained enough dietary choices to feed a small space station. "Let's see. What do growing Vorthani actually eat in their natural habitat?" The answer, according to the xenobiology databases, was both complicated and fascinating. Young Vorthani were omnivores with a particular preference for fruits that grew on their homeworld's crystal trees, supplemented by various small prey animals and a type of mineral-rich moss that apparently served as both food and medicine. The replicators can synthesize approximate nutritional equivalents, Dr. Whitman offered, though his tone suggested he wasn't entirely sure this was a good idea. Elizabeth selected options that seemed promising and activated the system, then stepped back to watch the cubs' reactions. The change was immediate and dramatic. Ghost's silver markings began cycling through patterns Elizabeth hadn't seen before, while Ember's golden glow shifted to deeper, warmer tones. Storm simply sat up straighter, his dark eyes fixed on the dispenser with unmistakable anticipation. When the synthesized meal materialized, all three cubs approached their bowls with enthusiasm that made the previous day's reluctant eating seem pathetic by comparison. But it was what happened next that sent shockwaves through the observation deck. Storm carried his bowl to Elizabeth and set it down beside her, before returning to collect Ember's bowl and doing the same. Ghost needed no prompting. He brought his own bowl and arranged it so that all four meals were grouped together in a rough circle. "They want to eat together," Elizabeth said, her voice soft with wonder. "They're inviting me to join their pack." The invitation was impossible to refuse. Elizabeth retrieved her own rations and settled into the circle, noting how the cubs arranged themselves so that they could all maintain visual contact while eating. It was a level of social sophistication that challenged every assumption the Galactic Council had made about predator species and pack behavior. "This is unprecedented." Fluxmoth's voice carried none of his usual pompous certainty. "Vorthani don't share territory with other species. They don't form multi-species social groups. They certainly don't." "Don't what?" Elizabeth asked, though she suspected she knew where this was heading. "Don't choose," Vashkon finished, his voice heavy with implications that made everyone uncomfortable. Predator species don't choose their social bonds. They're driven by instinct, by genetic programming, by survival necessity. But choice implies something else entirely. Elizabeth looked around the circle at three pairs of eyes that watched her with unmistakable affection and trust. Ghost's silver markings had settled into a steady, gentle glow. Ember's golden patterns pulsed in rhythm with her own heartbeat, and Storm's dark eyes held depths of intelligence and emotion that made her chest tight with something that might have been hope. "Yes," she said quietly. "It does." The afternoon brought new revelations as Elizabeth began introducing simple tools and puzzles to gauge the cubs' problem-solving abilities. What she discovered sent shockwaves through every xenobiology department in the galaxy. The cubs weren't just intelligent. They were collaborative learners who approached problems as a team, communicated through a combination of vocalizations and bioluminescent patterns, and demonstrated spatial reasoning abilities that rivaled some spacefaring species. When Elizabeth presented them with a complex puzzle box designed for adult Vorthani testing, they solved it in under 10 minutes, through a combination of Ghost's investigative skills, Ember's pattern recognition, and Storm's strategic thinking. "They're not just predators," Elizabeth said, as she watched Storm carefully manipulate the puzzle's final mechanism while his siblings provided light and guidance. "They're engineers." The implications were staggering. The Galactic Council had classified Vorthani as dangerous wildlife, suitable only for observation or elimination. But if the cubs' abilities were representative of their species' true potential, "We need to contact the homeworld authorities," Dr. Whitman said, his voice tight with urgency. "If there are more like them." He was interrupted by an alarm that sent red lights flashing throughout the containment area. Elizabeth looked up from her notes to see all 3 cubs in defensive positions, their bodies tense with alertness as they scanned for threats. "What's happening?" she called to the observation deck, but the response she got made her blood run cold. "Motion sensors have detected multiple incoming ships." Commander Vale's voice carried the kind of controlled urgency that meant serious trouble. "Unknown configuration. Heading directly for our position." Elizabeth looked down at the cubs, who were now clustered around her in a protective formation that spoke of instincts older than civilization. Storm's dark markings seemed to absorb the emergency lighting, making him look like a living shadow. Ghost had gone perfectly still, his silver patterns barely visible. Ember's golden glow had shifted to amber warning tones that made Elizabeth's skin prickle. "They know," she said, though she wasn't entirely sure what she meant. "Know what?" Fluxmoth demanded. Elizabeth met Storm's gaze and saw her own suspicions reflected in those intelligent, dark eyes. "They know we found them. The incoming ships turned out to be a false alarm, just a hegemony patrol squadron running late for their day, the scheduled check-in." But the cubs' reaction to the emergency had been a revelation that kept Elizabeth awake long into the station's artificial night cycle. They hadn't just responded to the alarm, they'd responded to her emotional state, forming a protective circle around her with the kind of instinctive coordination that spoke of evolutionary adaptations far more sophisticated than anyone had realized. Which was why, at 0200 station time, Elizabeth found herself standing outside the containment area with a sleeping bag and what remained of her common sense. "This is a terrible idea," Dr. Whitman said, for the 15th time. Though his protests had lost most of their conviction around repetition number 12. "The safety protocols exist for very good reasons, and sleeping in an enclosure with 3 apex predators violates approximately 18 different regulations." 19? Commander Vale corrected helpfully. "You forgot the one about unauthorized overnight accommodation in restricted zones." Elizabeth keyed in her access codes, noting how the cubs immediately appeared at the barrier despite the late hour. They'd been waiting for her. The safety protocols were written for containing hostile specimens. These 3 aren't hostile, they're traumatized. And traumatized kids have nightmares. Kids. Bashkan's voice carried the flat disbelief of someone whose species had never experienced childhood. "You're anthropomorphizing again." "No," Elizabeth said, watching as Storm pressed his paw against the barrier in what had become their standard greeting ritual. "I'm recognizing universal patterns of psychological development. Fear responses, bonding behaviors, trust-building exercises. These aren't human concepts. They're survival strategies that evolved independently across dozens of species." The barrier retracted with a soft hiss that made Ghost's ears perk up with interest. Elizabeth stepped inside, dragging her sleeping bag behind her, and was immediately surrounded by 3 very large, very concerned predators who seemed to think she'd lost her mind. "Hello to you too," she said, as Ember nuzzled against her shoulder with the kind of gentle affection that would have made the watching aliens question everything they thought they knew about predator behavior. Yes, I know it's late. No, I'm not here to run tests or collect samples. I'm here because… She paused, realizing that explaining human intuition to a bunch of diplomatic observers was probably futile. How could she tell them that something in the cub's behavior reminded her of her own childhood, of nights spent huddled under blankets after her parents' divorce, when sleep seemed impossible, and every shadow held potential threats? Because sometimes, when you're scared and far from home, having someone nearby makes all the difference. She finished quietly. Storm's response was immediate and devastating in its simplicity. The massive cub settled down beside Elizabeth's sleeping bag and rested his head on her shoulder with the kind of trust that made her throat tight with unexpected emotion. Ghost curled up at her feet, his silver markings providing a gentle nightlight that pushed back the containment area's harsh shadows. Ember arranged herself on Elizabeth's other side, her golden glow settling into the slow, steady rhythm of deep contentment. Remarkable, someone whispered over the observation deck's comm system. Though Elizabeth was too focused on the warm weight of Storm's head against her shoulder to identify the speaker. She'd expected to lie awake for hours, hyper-aware of the fact that she was essentially camping with 3 creatures who could kill her without breaking stride. What she hadn't expected was for the cub's presence to be so profoundly calming. Their breathing fell into synchronized patterns that reminded her of ocean waves, and the gentle warmth radiating from their bodies created a cocoon of safety that made the containment area feel less like a prison and more like home. Elizabeth woke 6 hours later to find that Storm had shifted during the night, curling his massive frame around her sleeping bag in a protective circle that would have made any parent proud. Ghost had migrated from her feet to her side, his silver markings pulsing in what she was beginning to recognize as contentment patterns. Ember had somehow managed to drape one paw over Elizabeth's arm without waking her, creating a living blanket that was both impossibly soft and unmistakably possessive. "Good morning," she whispered, noting how all 3 cubs stirred at the sound of her voice despite the early hour. "Sleep well?" The response was a chorus of soft vocalizations that her universal translator couldn't parse, but her heart interpreted as variations on, "Yes, thank you for asking. This is unprecedented." Dr. Whitman's voice carried a note of scientific excitement that made Elizabeth smile. "The behavioral changes are remarkable. Stress indicators are at the lowest levels we've recorded since containment began." Elizabeth sat up carefully, noting how the cubs adjusted their positions to maintain contact without restricting her movement. "They were scared," she said simply. "Not aggressive, not hostile. Just scared kids who needed someone to tell them they were safe. The implications are…" Fluxmoth's voice trailed off, as he apparently ran out of words to describe what they'd just witnessed. "Are significant," Vashkhan finished, though his tone suggested he was still processing the ramifications. "If Vorthani social bonding extends beyond species barriers, if they can form emotional attachments to non-pack members," Commander Vale added, "then everything we know about predator psychology needs to be reconsidered." Elizabeth was about to respond when the cubs suddenly went rigid around her, their bodies tensing with alertness as they focused on something beyond the containment barriers. Storm's head lifted from her shoulder, his dark eyes scanning the room with predatory intensity. Ghost's silver markings began cycling through rapid warning patterns, Ember's golden glow shifted to the amber tones that Elizabeth had learned meant danger. "What is it?" Elizabeth asked, though part of her already knew the answer. The cub's response was swift and terrifying. All three moved to positions between Elizabeth and the containment area's entrance, their bodies low and ready for combat. Storm's rumble was so deep it seemed to vibrate through the floor itself. Ghost had gone perfectly still, except for his markings, which were now flashing in patterns that looked almost like a targeting system. Ember's amber glow had intensified to the point where Elizabeth could feel heat radiating from her fur. Motion detectors are picking up movement in the restricted sections. Commander Vale's voice carried the kind of controlled urgency that meant serious trouble. Someone's in the facility who shouldn't be there. The lights went out. Emergency illumination kicked in immediately, bathing everything in red light that made the cub's defensive postures look even more menacing. Elizabeth's hand found Storm's shoulder, feeling the coiled tension in his muscles as he prepared for whatever was coming. "Security teams are responding," Vale continued, her voice tight with concentration. "Estimated time to containment breach." She was interrupted by the sound of the main laboratory door exploding inward. What came through the smoke and debris wasn't a person. It was a combat drone, sleek and deadly, and moving with the kind of predatory grace that suggested military-grade technology. Its scanning beams swept the containment area, paused when they found the cubs, and immediately shifted to targeting mode. "Unauthorized weapons discharge detected," the station's computer announced, with the kind of calm helpfulness that was absolutely useless in a crisis. "Please evacuate the area in an orderly fashion." Elizabeth's response was immediate and instinctive. She threw herself between the drone and the cubs, her arms spread wide as if she could somehow shield three apex predators with her own body. "No! They're not threats!" The drone's response was a low hum that indicated weapon charging. What happened next would be talked about in xenobiology circles for decades to come. Storm moved first, his massive frame launching into the air with impossible grace as he intercepted the drone's targeting beam. Ghost flanked left, his silver markings now strobing in patterns that seemed to confuse the drone's sensors. Ember went right, her golden glow blazing with intensity that turned the emergency lighting irrelevant. But it wasn't their combat prowess that made Elizabeth's heart race, it was their coordination. The three cubs moved like a single organism, anticipating each other's actions with precision that spoke of genetic memory older than civilization. They weren't just fighting, they were hunting. The drone never had a chance. Storm's claws found purchase on its armored shell, sending it spinning into Ghost's waiting jaws. Ember's heat somehow interfered with its electronics, causing weapon systems to misfire and navigation to fail catastrophically. Within 30 seconds, the military-grade combat drone was reduced to expensive scrap metal scattered across the containment area floor. "Threat neutralized," Storm announced. Though Elizabeth was fairly certain the universal translator was taking liberties with his actual vocalization. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of security teams finally arriving to secure an area that no longer needed securing. "Well," Dr. Whitman said, eventually, his voice carrying the kind of stunned respect usually reserved for natural disasters, "I think we can definitively say that the cubs are capable of distinguishing between threats and allies." Elizabeth looked down at the drone's remains, then at the three cubs who were now clustered around her with expressions that could only be described as smugly satisfied. "They protected me," she said, though the words felt inadequate for what had just happened. More than that, Commander Vale's voice carried a note of professional assessment that made Elizabeth uncomfortable. They demonstrated tactical coordination, adaptive problem-solving under stress, and… She paused, clearly struggling with the implications. They made a choice. The drone wasn't targeting them initially. It was scanning for threats. They could have stayed hidden and let it complete its assessment. But they didn't. Elizabeth said, understanding dawning like a cold weight in her stomach. They saw it as a threat to me. Which means, Vashkon added with the kind of grim certainty that military strategists brought to worst-case scenarios, that someone sent that drone specifically to test their protective instincts. The implications hung in the air like a challenge to everything they thought they knew about the Cubs' situation. Elizabeth knelt beside Storm, running her fingers through his dark fur as she tried to process what had just happened. The Cubs had risked themselves to protect her not because of pack instincts or territorial behavior, but because they'd made a conscious decision about who mattered to them. The mining colony attack, Elizabeth said slowly, pieces of a puzzle clicking into place with sickening clarity. It wasn't random, was it? No. Fluxmoth's voice carried the weight of political revelation that would reshape interstellar relations. It wasn't, and I suspect these three know exactly who was responsible. Elizabeth looked into Storm's dark eyes and saw her own suspicions reflected there. The Cubs hadn't been captured after a random attack, they'd been rescued, and someone wanted them back badly enough to send military-grade hardware after them. The question was, what were 3 Vorthani Cubs worth, that someone would risk interstellar incident to reclaim them? The answer, Elizabeth suspected, was going to change everything. We need to contact the Vorthani homeworld, she said, though part of her already knew it was too late for simple diplomatic solutions. These Cubs have information that someone is willing to kill for. Storm's response was a soft sound that the translator couldn't parse, but Elizabeth understood perfectly. It was the sound of someone saying goodbye, because they knew that everything was about to change. And in the red-tinted emergency lighting, with drone debris scattered around them like metallic snow, Elizabeth realized that the Cubs had been trying to tell her something important from the very beginning. They weren't the victims of the mining colony attack. They were the only witnesses who'd survived to tell the truth about what really happened there. And someone was very, very determined to make sure that truth never came to light. The truth came out in fragments over the next 6 hours, extracted from classified files that Commander Vale somehow acquired through channels that probably violated several treaties. The mining operation on Kethvar hadn't been mining at all. It had been a weapons development facility, using captured Vorthani adults to create biological warfare agents. The Cubs had witnessed their parents being tortured, experimented on, and ultimately killed in the name of military advancement. They'd survived only because a security malfunction had allowed them to escape during the facility's destruction. An explosion that the corporate sponsors had blamed on a random predator attack to cover their tracks. They're not just witnesses, Elizabeth said, watching as Storm carefully arranged his siblings in their preferred sleeping formation despite the day's chaos. They're evidence. Living proof of war crimes that could destabilize half the galaxy's military contracts. Which explains the drone, Vashkon added, grimly. And why someone was willing to risk an interstellar incident to silence them. The political ramifications were staggering, but Elizabeth found herself focusing on something far more immediate. The way Ghost kept looking toward the containment area's exit, his silver markings dim with what she'd learned to recognize as sadness. Ember's golden glow had settled into the deep, steady patterns of grief. And Storm. Storm was watching Elizabeth with the kind of patient attention that suggested he was waiting for her to make an important decision. "The Galactic Council wants to relocate them," Fluxmoth said, his usual pomposity replaced by genuine regret. "Witness protection protocols require immediate transfer to a secure facility where they can be properly debriefed. And never see sunlight again. Never have choices. Never form bonds. Never be anything more than living testimony in a legal case that could drag on for decades." The silence that followed was broken by a soft sound from the containment area. All eyes turned to see the cubs arranged in their family formation, but with a fourth space left deliberately open. A space exactly the right size for one human xenobiologist who'd somehow become the most important person in their world. Their island. Another option, Commander Vale said carefully. "The Cubs' legal status island. Complicated. They're not property, not prisoners, and not exactly refugees. Technically, they have the right to choose their own guardian." Elizabeth's heart stopped. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying." Vale continued with the kind of careful precision that suggested she'd been thinking about this for hours. That if a qualified xenobiologist were to apply for custodial guardianship, and if 3 very intelligent cubs were to indicate their preference clearly enough for legal documentation. She trailed off, gesturing toward the containment area where Storm had risen and was now pressing his paw against the barrier with unmistakable intent. "They've already chosen," Elizabeth whispered. The formal test was almost anticlimactic. When the barriers retracted and paths to both the diplomatic transport and Elizabeth's personal quarters were opened, the Cubs' decision took exactly 15 seconds to make and a lifetime to process. Ghost reached Elizabeth first, his silver markings blazing with joy as he wound around her legs. Ember followed, her golden glow shifting to warm amber tones that spoke of coming home. Storm approached last, as always, but when he pressed his forehead against Elizabeth's palm, the gesture carried the weight of species-altering precedent. "Well," Dr. Whitman said, as bureaucrats throughout the galaxy prepared to rewrite their xenobiology textbooks, "I suppose that settles the question of whether predator cubs can be tamed." Elizabeth looked down at 3 pairs of eyes that watched her with unmistakable love and trust, then smiled with the kind of fierce protectiveness that would have made any parent proud. "They were never tamed," she said softly. "They just chose their family. And in a galaxy built on the assumption that different species couldn't truly understand each other, 3 orphaned predators and 1 stubborn human proved that sometimes love really was a universal language. Even if it came with claws, bioluminescent fur, and a tendency to destroy military-grade hardware when properly motivated.